Hello and welcome to Latika Takes, a podcast with me, Latika Berg. Welcome back to the podcast. Thanks ever for listening. I'm really super grateful to those of you who have sent me your comments, thoughts and feedback. Keep them coming, including any suggestions for who you might like me to try and interview for you. Any ideas, any topics, any themes. I'm totally open to all of your suggestions. Anyway, this week, I have a super guest for you. His name is John Spencer. He's retired US Major and happens to be one of the world's leading, if not the world's leading, specialist in researching and understanding urban warfare. So he's made multiple trips to Ukraine and Gaza since those wars began, and he's been on a tour of Australia this last week, sharing some of that knowledge, including with some of the think tanks I work very closely with. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute is just one of those. I caught up with John during his visit, and I began by asking him how his interest in urban warfare specifically began.
Sure. Well, I guess because I'm paid to be, as I'm the chair of urban warfare studies at a research center that I helped create at West Point called the Modern War Institute. But I actually started studying, of course, I had two tours in Iraq and had my own urban warfare fights, like in the Battle of Sadr City in 2008, even in part of the battles of the invasion I took a part of. But in 2014, I was a part of a think tank for our four-star general looking at megacities and the growth of cities around the world, which really started my academic look. Because yes, you're right, even teaching strategy at West Point like I did, we cover the whole continuum of warfare and war and history and everything. But I started writing about urban warfare as a part of the research center I was creating, and there became a realization both in the study for the general in the Pentagon that there was nobody doing it. There's no research center, there's no scholar, there's no school, there's nothing, which is really interesting when you look at it from any military's perspective. It's like, who's your urban warfare people? There isn't. There's some tactical, clear room kind of stuff, but academically or even institutionally, there's a giant gap. And I fell into that and fell in love with the newness of involving yourself in a field of study where there is nobody doing the work. After I retired from active duty, though, as a researcher of war, I started going into places like Nagorno-Karabakh, Ukraine, Gaza, furthering how to do research in urban combat, how to piece together urban battles, how it factored into the war. So a lot of personal, but really professional interest and for over a decade now, I've only focused on that. Like you said, I can't compete with some of the other people that study the complete history of war and just strategic of all wars. But I can really focus in on how the urban areas or the objectives that are urban centric play into into it all.
Well, let's begin with Ukraine, because this is a war where we've got both sorts of fronts. You've been there, I think, several times since the war began. What have you seen in terms of the adaptation of Ukraine's approach to urban warfare, and also how or not this has affected what we see now, which is essentially a stalemate, but also that early pushback against the Russian invasion?
Yeah, and why I took so much interest really in the beginning of Ukraine is because we have these things called decisive battles in combat, which are battles that determine the strategic goals for both sides. And for Russia, in order to achieve its strategic goal in the beginning of the war, it was to overthrow the Ukrainian government and basically to make it Russian. But it had to get into the urban areas where the capital city, with the history of war, the capital cities are the economic engines, the seat of political power. This became really a very big test of Western ideology of war versus the reality of geography, where Russia's goal was to take Ukraine. It had to take Kyiv. So I went into Ukraine 4 times just trying to piece together what happened in this most decisive battle in modern history, the Battle of Kyiv, where if Kyiv would have fallen, we wouldn't be talking about the Ukraine war right now. But it didn't fall. Why was that? Why did Russia, every objective Russia had in the beginning of the war was urban centers. Kyiv, Mariupol, Sumy, Kharkiv, Kherson. They were all these major urban areas, but the world has changed, which were the same of past wars like World War II. I mean, there's a major battle for Kyiv at the beginning of World War II, but the world has changed. Everybody's militaries are smaller. So now you start seeing the major, most critical fights happening in the urban areas rather than outside the urban areas, which is what all the research had been screaming up to this point to see it real time. On Russia, 200,000 Russian forces is a lot, but spread across 7 cities like they did, it's really not much. And for Ukrainians with a small force, but also what I teach, urban areas are not just the buildings, but are a population of people and the infrastructure. What you saw Ukraine do was mobilize its urban areas to resist nationally what Russia was trying to achieve. So it wasn't that they defeated Russia, it just stopped Russia from achieving what it needed to achieve. And in April, when it successfully defended its cities through the use of its civilians, which kind of gets discounted in some of the military theology as, military versus military. Like, how about those, 50 million people in that area? And if they get turned into military, even if they're civil defenders, then it's still a concept called total defense. That is a very ancient concept as well, but really not thought of in current military theories. Is like, well, what if you mobilize the entire nation? Levée en masse 2.0. You see what you saw in Ukraine, which worked to stop the Russians from achieving, didn't win the overall war, but it definitely took Russia's ability to take the nation away for now. And then Russia shifted its objectives, made it very much bigger geographic areas of concern. And then the war evolved to where now, where the defense is something in modern times has been shown to be a very big trend in war, is where the defense becomes the predominant form of achieving the political goal. Ukraine was forced to then build an army in war from 100,000 to 1 million and go on the offense where they're attacking urban areas themselves. So it has been an evolution and why it evolved to large geographic fronts where you have trench warfare and all this. But the urban areas still being the big fights. So even as we're talking today, whether you're talking about Advika or all these other places where the urban battles, all roads lead to urban. And nobody has a military where the only fight is outside the urban areas. No, it comes down to who can take that city, defend that city, own that city. That is the evolution that we've seen.
So let's stay on Ukraine for a minute. Can you give me some practical examples about, particularly in that Battle of Kyiv, what civilians did that was particularly effective in stopping and stymieing ultimately the Russian advance into Kyiv? I've read examples, for example, of where they've created apps to log where they saw Russian invaders coming through, and that was a really interesting and vital data set for the military. But also, could you elaborate a little bit more about how you coordinate what I guess is a very loose civilian structure at the start of an invasion like this? How do you actually mobilize this from a hierarchical level? And what are the lessons and ways that you would teach that to other societies? And capping on that, I think Sweden actually and Finland are very good at this total defense ideology. So it's not quite true to say nobody thinks about this. I think we do have some examples where this is built in at a societal level, yeah?
Yeah, no. And some of them had it for a long time. I mean, after World War II, there were publications, and you probably read where I created a manual for Ukraine days after the Russian invasion for civilians, which in other countries, like the Swedish have a version, the British had a version after World War II, where it was very common for civilians to think about defending their nation. And in Finland, with the gun culture and the plans and all the architecture that was built, but nations get complacent and nations forget. So I developed this manual to give its civilians instructions. But in the Battle of Kyiv, which is really interesting, like you said, it's where the old theology of like total defense, and immediately upon the invasion, the Ukrainian government starts putting out over the radio, resist. So resist the Russian. But that was about the extent of the instructions. I wrote a little quick manual and used social media to push it out and on what I would recommend as somebody who studies urban combat, some of the structures already there, where in Kyiv you have pockets of veterans, you have pockets of community defenders, but the geography of the city is also different. There's a long list of things that the police were doing before the invasion, that the military, there was only one brigade in the city, was or wasn't doing at the time. But you're right on even the information aspect. The Ukrainian government, part of like almost like the defense industry, had this thing called Delta, which was a computer system that could integrate all the different sensors, whether it's a drone or a bank camera or whatever, into one common operational picture. And as soon as the Russians invaded, as soon as the Russians were at least delayed at places like Hostomel, this computer system called Delta gives the Ukrainians the ability to take a very small amount of military and civilian power in the city and then direct it to where it's needed most, as in where is there a breakthrough in the defense. But they also did things like they dropped all the bridges around the city, which is very, very important. And it was unplanned. Actually, a little bit of this was actually just disaggregated chaos with everybody trying to help. Some of them, being seen through the Delta system and being able to use like the 1 battalion of artillery of the Ukrainian military, who's doing the work of like an entire army, because it can see the Russian formations through this Delta system. They drop all the bridges and make it really hard for Russians to drive to where they want to go. They blew a dam in the north, which creates this barrier to one of the vulnerable routes into the city. And then you had civilians like in Bucha in the first opening days who create ambushes to Russians who didn't think they were going to be fighting at all. And it all adds up. But the Delta system and what you were talking about, the DIA system, which is the Ukrainians, all this happening within days, turned a government app that usually controls their passports, their driver's license and everything into report enemy. So they took this app they already had, which gave the civilians the ability to report enemy, which then drives a report into this DIA, not the DIA system, which reports into the Delta system that gives them this common operational picture that they always know where the Russians are. And if they have anything they can push that way, whether it's a killer drone, which they had a few, or a formation or a group of civilians, it gave them this ability just to wear down the Russian machine who's stuck on the roads, running out of ammo, running out of gas, really frustrated, making mistakes. That is what they needed to do. But also there's the kind of what we see now, and we'll talk about it, I'm sure, in Gaza. This is a war being fought out on globally. I could watch live YouTube feeds in Kyiv from the very opening days. I started seeing CNN reporters at Hostomel, but also images of Russian helicopters that had been down were spreading across Ukraine and the world, which actually was very influential in motivating Ukrainians to fight, was the belief that they could fight, because war is a contest of will. If Russia could have gotten into, which some people discount Russia's mistakes, I, having studied the Battle of Kyiv, know that Russia was close. And had they gotten to the center, the government center, and raised the Russian flag, we probably wouldn't be talking about the Ukrainian war, because war is a contest of will. Psychologically, if they could convince even the city of Kyiv, let alone the nation of Ukraine, that they have been defeated, that would have meant a lot. But you had the opposite with Zelensky, having multiple press conferences on the day of the invasion and a press conference every day, and social media moments like the downed helicopter or Snake Island. I need ammo. I don't need a ride. That is, all this collection of chaos that is a success in the opening moments of preventing Russia from winning. Not necessarily winning, but preventing Russia from winning, and watching as the war has continued to evolve.
I wonder, we will move to Gaza, but I wonder what you make, just finally on Ukraine, of the revelation that the Biden administration has finally allowed Ukraine to use long-range missiles to attack targets in Russia. Is this too late now?
It could be. It could. I was a strong one. This is trying to explain to the world war. And I'm the urban warfare guy, and a lot of these were urban battles initially. But I'm also, I taught strategy at West Point to understand, like, we started off by giving Ukraine 4 artillery pieces, 10 tanks, like all of that was just like, what did you expect Ukraine to do with that? And then as the number figure starts to increase, but a true understanding of what has actually Ukraine received and the limitation on what they have received, you can do these things, you can't do these things. So yes, that was an important moment, but if you really write the history of this moment of, well, we can't give Ukraine tanks. That will be an escalation, and Russia will do something more. Like literally, that was the big statement. We can't give them main battle tanks. We can't give them ATACMS that can shoot farther. Now we can't let them strike at the military, installations just on the other side of the border that are attacking them. It's been a really hard lesson for people to understand the basically that all war is politics, and the risk aversion that the United States and others have had with committing to wanting Ukraine to win, and this escalation risk intolerance that they've had. So it's a positive, but yeah, it might be, frankly, a little too late to have a significant play into how the war ends.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so fed up of this line with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Why not with what it takes? I've never understood the difference between the rhetoric here and what the West has actually done. And it's odd. We have now, with the Trump administration coming in, more of a sense of how Ukraine might end as a conflict than we do with Israel, which I think is a nice segue into talking about your experiences in Gaza, because not many reporters get into Gaza. It's controlled by Israel, that access, but you've been in, and you've actually been in the tunnels as well. And I'm fascinated to learn what you know about these tunnels.
Yeah. One of the reasons I was able to get into Gaza so quickly is that I've been studying Israel's wars for a long time. So it wasn't like John Spencer showed up into Israel and then immediately got access. I have been going to Israel for years, running tunnel conferences with academic institutions in Israel, studying underground warfare. Again, because of that urban flavor, Israel has a very different approach to urban warfare than most countries, because they face these very contested urban fights, like the Battle of Suez City, Jenin, Nablus, the Battle of Jerusalem 67, where the context is a lot different. So I have been going and doing podcasts and case studies in Israel, which allowed me, but I'd also been studying Hamas tunnels. I'd been in Hamas tunnels, Hezbollah tunnels before this war. Nobody knew truly what the Hamas tunnel network was. In the estimates that we all had, even within this underground warfare academic space, were way off. And yes, I have been since October 7th now into tunnels like the one they found 100 meters outside the wall of Israel that was 2.5 miles long. It was an invasion tunnel, very similar to the one I'd been into between North and South Korea that they found in the 70s, but one you could flow thousands of troops in, drive trucks through, multi-million-dollar investment in air ventilation, power, communications,
So
everything.
hang on, John. Describe these tunnels to me. How wide are they? How tall are they? What are the conditions? You talked about ventilation. Is it hot? Are you stooping? Are they lit? I mean, what is that tunnel act? I'm fascinated to know what these tunnels actually look like and feel like.
Yeah, so I have to give you, so there's 450 plus miles of tunnels in Gaza, ranging, I mean, bigger than the London Metro, the Seoul Metro, the New York City Metro. So it's hard for people to comprehend just the scale of it, but then also the variety, right? So a normal Hamas tunnel, which is, we have actually Hamas tunnel replicas all around, even in the United States, because they're very standardized, because the geology allows them to dig them quickly, where a standard Hamas tunnel is just 3 meters wide and 5 meters tall. Like you could barely fit one person down it shoulder to shoulder, and then they'll go for a mile like that. You're hunched in going through that. They have a lot of those, but like the one that I was in December, the one I was telling you about, you could drive trucks through. It was massive. And they found many of those, to include ones that actually go underneath riverbeds.
Wow.
Connecting north. So some of them are very, like, there's just a shaft and a tunnel. You don't want to be there because it's so tight. You get claustrophobia and it's so damp and dusty. Then you have these more open ones, but it's still, you're right. The temperature changes. You start sweating. And the one I was in December, immediately going into them. But there's such a variety where they have, deep buried luxury tunnels for with air conditioner and ceiling fans and refrigerators and you name it. They converted some into prisons after October 7th, where they found them with complete cages. And the ones in Rafah where the 6 hostages were killed was just a horrible, awful environment to live in, to even stand in, let alone live in, where they're having to go to the bathroom in buckets and the feces is in the air. Like these are very foreign environments. You lose sense of time when you're underground for a long time. A lot of things that soldiers face, even if they enter a tunnel for a short amount of time, they can get all kinds of conditions of their mind. It's just gets turned upside down. They're just such foreign environments and awful to even they have Hamas manuals now talking about make sure you rotate to the surface because it will really mess with you mentally and physically to stay underground for a long time, let alone just getting like vitamin D or anything. But the air that you breathe down there, even with the advanced ventilation, which the one I was in was a really big one, in order to be able to drive a truck through a tunnel and not kill yourself from carbon monoxide requires a very strong ventilation system. But even if you don't have that, the air, because you're stepping in the contamination of you being there, can be very toxic to anybody, let alone a hostage.
Do we know much about how Hamas, one, gets the equipment to do this and affords it?
Yeah. So we know a little bit, and there's actually estimates now that it takes about $275,000 per kilometer for Hamas to build a tunnel. So that's about, I did the figures of taking like 700 kilometers of tunnels times that $275,000. So it'd be equivalent to like $11 billion US to build what they built. But at one point, they were tracking like 200 trucks full of cement going into Gaza. Everybody's ideas of what the blockade, when Israel would search things, one of the things that was always contested was cement. Like, how much cement do you need? And there's not high rises going up, but billions of dollars invested, not in the infrastructure. So, this is the whole, what Hamas used any international aid money for in Gaza wasn't for any infrastructure, right? The water salination plants were left to decay and are broken, but just the sheer number of concrete, and there's also steel in the wall, so steel rebar that would be required to build this over 20 years, although there were some tunnels being built even when Israel was there before withdrawing in 2005. But yeah, it almost escapes comprehension of how they built this, how much financial money, how much engineering, how much work. So they, basically it was a profession. Like if you wanted to make some money, you dig one of the Hamas's tunnels, or you even allow them to dig it underneath your home and you get a certain amount of subsidy for that. Because there's no way that anybody, whether it's UNRWA, a civilian, or anybody, didn't know where these tunnels were underneath their homes, their schools, their mosques, their hospitals, whatever. So it's a very complicated. I usually get like, how did Israel not know? So Israel, of course, knew that they were digging tunnels, but they also had left Gaza officially and even in theory. Like they can do what they want in Gaza as long as we got our wall, which the underground portion of the wall, because the biggest threat for Israel wasn't the tunnels in Gaza, it was the cross-border tunnels that they would use to pop up, grab a soldier, and take back into the tunnels. And Israel fixed that. Actually, the underground wall that Israel built with electronic sensors that go all the way down to the water table worked. Of course, that didn't help on October 7th, but like that one that I told you about, which was 100 meters outside the wall, I think it was built before the wall, and then the wall stopped it from then going underneath the Israeli-Gaza border. So there's so many facets of it to it, but it's really hard for people to comprehend.
So there's so many questions involved with this underground warfare. I mean, when I was on the border of Lebanon, when I was in Israel, they were describing to me how they were filling them with cement where they would find these tunnels. You can watch on
Right.
YouTube, I believe, where you see
Yep.
Hezbollah fighters kind of popping up overground on the other side as their tunnels are being filled. One, are the tunnels cleared? I mean, Israel has had a year now of bombarding Gaza. what's the state of how occupied those tunnels are? And two, once and if this war is ever finished, and I'm very keen to hear your views about how this war in Gaza ends and when, because it is costing political support for Western governments right around the world so much. What happens with the tunnels? Are they going to be filled with cement? Are they going to be flooded? What is the plan for disabling them for good? Because part of Israel's stated goal in Gaza is to degrade Hamas. Presumably, that is degrading the tunnel infrastructure.
Yeah, it's a great question with multiple kind of facets of it. One, you asked, how is it going with clearing the tunnels? Israel hasn't found all the tunnels. It hasn't. There are vast areas where Israel hasn't even been in Gaza. But I also, having just been I was there in July in the Netzarim corridor, where there are thousands of tunnel shafts, and they found over 6,000 tunnel shafts. And it's an acknowledgement that even places they went into, like Jabalia, where they barely went into in the beginning, they're going back into and still discovering massive underground weapons manufacturing plants and tunnels, to these massive tunnels that connect different areas. Really, Israel actually being on the ground and discovering tunnels has realized that there are different levels of tunnels, right? There are these more strategic tunnels, like the 100+ tunnels they found between Gaza and Egypt, that was the superhighway of support to Hamas's power. Nobody could have imagined there would be 100 of them. They thought there might have been some, but more that you could drive trucks through. Those are all strategic assets to Hamas. Those tunnels that you can go from north to South Gaza through miles-long tunnels underneath the Wadi Gaza, those are strategic to Hamas. But if you realize, like I have in being in Khan Yunis, where every step you take, there is most likely a tunnel underneath you. Some of them connect house to house, and some of them are much, may have like command and control purposes, like the data center they found underneath the UNRWA headquarters in northern Gaza, or a Yahya Sinwar command and control center tunnel in Khan Yunis. All these different types of tunnels are what Israel has had to discover and then make the decision on what do they do about it. So I can say with strong confidence that Israel hasn't even found all the tunnels, let alone cleared them all. Then I can say with confidence that even when they find them all, they won't be able to destroy them all. Because you just talked about like the wet cement that was used in northern Israel because they couldn't go into Lebanon. So what they did is they just brought 20 trucks of wet cement costing tens of thousands of dollars of wet cement that isn't infinite, and just flooded it until it started coming up the other side, and they flew a drone and you can watch it. That won't work in Gaza. Nobody in the world has that much wet cement to fill 450 miles of tunnels with wet cement. And, oh, by the way, that doesn't destroy a tunnel. That just blocks a tunnel. So you can dig through wet cement just as much as you can dig hard rock, as they can in northern, in southern Lebanon or in Israel. Israel did try flooding, which was actually proven to work some, I guess not completely, along the Gaza-Egypt border when Egypt decided to destroy all of Hamas's smuggling tunnels in 2016 to 18. They used flooding of sewer water, really human rights violation kind of, and seawater, because the Hamas tunnels there were very primitive, as in they were just holes with some shoring. They weren't the solid concrete ones that I just described to you, that is the standard Hamas tunnel. But in the war, in the beginning, Israel brought in 5 industrial level pumps and started pumping seawater and fresh water into the tunnels, somewhat to flush Hamas fighters out of the tunnels, but also to see if it would destroy a tunnel. Neither worked. They found that it would, and these pumps could fill an Olympic swimming pool in a matter of like 7 minutes, just massive pumps to flood areas with water. But it took 2 weeks in one area just to bring it to the surface to flush fighters out. And it didn't work because the water would just drain out, because these, they're cement, but they're not closed tubes. So the water would just seep out through the walls, or in some of these, they actually had drainage holes in them. So the only way to destroy a tunnel is to blow it with explosive force. So to line a tunnels and complete tunnel shafts, like, so if you have a 2-mile tunnel, to line it with explosives about every 100 meters and string all that together and blow it. Israel has a liquid explosive that they can use, and they can drill a hole so they don't have to go into the tunnel. But mostly the way that they have to do it is by hand after a tunnel has been cleared, line it with explosives and then blow it, which is very destructive.
Okay, I'm not an engineer, but that sounds incredibly dangerous, right?
Correct. Yes. So and time consuming, right? So this has just been, but we've seen like massive, like that one I was in December that was 2.5 miles long. That's what they did. They lined that 2.5 miles with explosives inside the tunnel and blew it. Just imagine if 450 miles, if they blew every tunnel, what that would do to the surface even of the areas. And this is the ideal that people believe that all of Gaza is destroyed. It's not. Yes, there have been lots of areas in Gaza that have been destroyed by close combat against Hamas fighters defending those areas, much like other urban battles, like Mariupol, Mosul, Fallujah, where the cities are in close combat get destroyed. If you destroyed all the tunnels, one, there's probably not enough explosives anywhere. And this has been a big resource concern. But you don't have to, in order to demilitarize the Gaza Strip and remove Hamas's military capability, you don't have to destroy all the tunnels. There's lots of places where there are, even if you think about the Battle of Bakhmut and why it went so toughly for Russia, is that on one side of the river of Bakhmut, there's cellars in underneath the buildings, which made the fight a lot different. That doesn't mean for Gaza that you need to destroy all those house-to-house tunnels. So they're making really tough decisions on which tunnels to destroy once they find them. But it'll take months and months and months of, like they are in Rafah right now. They're still to this day clearing in Rafah to discover the tunnels and the supplies in the tunnels to then make a decision on which tunnels to destroy.
Isn't Israel's time running out, if not run out? Because we have seen essentially Israel becoming quite isolated from the international community. Obviously, the incoming Trump administration changes this a lot, but it is still the case that a lot of Europe remains against Israel continuing. We see the demand ceasefire now, not just on the streets in pro-Palestinian marches around the world, including in Australia where you are now, but also in the UK where I am, and of course in America, but also from world leaders. So how long has Israel got left, and can it achieve its war aims in the Gaza Strip? And why has it not been able to do so until now? Is it a political decision that this war has continued as long as it has, or is it actually capability? They have still not degraded Hamas's ability to wage attacks on Israel, notwithstanding that recent killing of Sinwar.
Yeah, it's a very complicated question, which you probably understand the nuances there of, for Israel to achieve its objectives, difficulty it has had in the last year, based on which all war is fought within a political context, both locally and internationally. So for Israel to return the hostages, destroy Hamas's political and military power, and prevent the Gaza Strip from being a threat to Israel ever again, how much time does Israel have left? I think that is primarily an Israel society question, not an international question, because I believe that despite all the misinformation about the way the war has been prosecuted, my belief being on the ground is that Israel has prosecuted the war very discriminately and very legally within the laws of war and protecting civilians, despite the unparalleled context in which the enemy they faced. Yes, Hamas as a military organization has been broken, but by definition, to win in war, to remove Hamas from power in the Gaza Strip, that would take a long time, because you have to prevent them from regaining the power that they don't have right now. They still have political power in the Gaza Strip. They still use humanitarian aid as a main source of power over the people. There's still the radicalization problem. There's still the actually reducing their power systematically. Yeah, I mean, just from a military context, they used to have 24 battalions with assigned geographic areas, and Israel says 23 of those battalions have been broken, not completely destroyed, but broken so they can no longer do their assigned function, and they've been pushed into this like guerrilla force, and they've been cut off from their supplies. But, if anybody was to say ceasefire now, like, look, they can't do another October 7th, which I think has been a problematic kind of position. You've achieved your goals. no, the 101 hostages are still being held, and how hard they would be, and somebody to think that you should negotiate with Hamas. Like, no, Hamas started a war on October 7th. Israel, in all right within all of our international laws, like the UN Charter, had the right to defend itself with the goal to remove that power that attacked them and to wage war against them. We've gotten used to short wars, and this is the same thing with Ukraine and Russia. It's like, if you believe these things can be done quickly, I believe that the international community, all this criticism of Israel has protracted this war and caused more human suffering had it not gone differently. And when Israel would have used more force, or the international community may have put more pressure on Egypt to allow the civilians to get out of harm's way, that there are so many varieties of differences that this war may have been prosecuted by any other military. But Israel, because of this belief on what Israel is doing, despite the on-the-ground information, has had to methodically pursue these goals and be effective in dismantling Hamas, bringing hostages home, and creating a new security framework where Hamas can't harm Israel again. But if you ceasefire now, Hamas, by my definition as a strategist, has achieved victory. It has attacked Israel on October 7th and survived as an organization with power. Yes, they'll have much less power than it ever has had in the last 20 years, but it still will have power. And just politically, because war is a contest of political goals, they will have achieved victory in attacking Israel and surviving as an organization with power, not an ideology. It's a different concept. It will have survived as the ruling power in Gaza, and the world would have forced Israel to be okay with leaving them in power.
So do you think government should be dropping that demand for ceasefire now?
Absolutely.
I mean, Australia, where you're now, is one of those governments calling for that alongside Canada. How do you think that the change in US administration will change the way Israel conducts that war?
Yeah.
And particularly regional here, because they've also expanded into Lebanon, they've struck in
So I think,
Syria.
and I try to stay apolitical as possible, because just analyzing objectively, I'm very pro-truth. I'm not Israeli, I'm not Jewish, although I've been dubbed as some type of pro-Israeli. I'm pro-truth. I believe the change in US foreign policy to include administration change, which are just facts, will change the entire Middle East calculations. At this point in the war against Hamas and Gaza, there's not a major change that can be done by Israel that would rapidly achieve a victory. Because in order to achieve victory, a new power has to be established in Gaza that will rule instead of Hamas, and then begin things like de-radicalization, disarmament, reconciliation, like all these things that we know in lower intensity post-conflict operation that has to be happening. But the change will do massive things, which I actually agree with this, actually. A ceasefire agreement between Hezbollah and Israel, where Hezbollah agrees to stop attacking Israel so that Israel can repopulate northern, where the international community can actually have a buffer zone that was supposed to be there between Hamas and Israel in Lebanon. But also the US administration, who has been very vocal that the framework with dealing with the Islamic regime in Iran will change, because all of this was only possible by the funding, support, training, arming that Iran has provided to its proxies to fight, destroy, attack Israel and Western entities, to from the Red Sea to you name it. That is probably the biggest change that will change everything. But unfortunately, for the war against Hamas and Gaza, where everybody wants, and I do too, I want to see the Palestinian people lives improve. I just have the objective understanding that the only thing that will continue the cycle of violence and the subjugation of the Palestinian people is leaving Hamas in Gaza to be you continue subjugating the Palestinian people. The only hope for improving and stopping the cycle of violence is to allow Israel to continue. There's no way to do it quickly now, methodically removing Hamas, his arms and his power in Gaza. The US and others, to include Australia and the international communities, acceptance, appeasement, reluctance to deal with the Islamic regime in Iran is the kind of the wild card that will change everything.
How has the power of the camera, I mean, we saw this change the game in Vietnam, as I remember being taught in modern history. How has the camera changed, particularly with drone warfare and that information war, what you've studied in Ukraine and Israel?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed. It's definitely changed a very ancient concept that war is a contest of wills, not just between the two militaries, but there are so many wars where we can show that I don't have to defeat you on the field of battle. You can win every battle. You're military strong, got it. But I can defeat you in your society to where you're not even willing to fight or you just quit fighting. The phone has changed that. What you mentioned about Vietnam was what we called the Cronkite effect. When an American reporter went to Vietnam, came back, told the American population there's no hope of winning. And we decided that we were no longer willing to invest in fighting against what we, for the reasons we were. The phone, which is really interesting for Israel, Israel has faced this algorithm driven social media concept of everybody seeing the most awful parts of war. War is killing, it is destruction. But now war is being fought where the phone is bringing it to the eyes of every citizen of every nation and really causing, which is very unfortunate, political leaders to try to hedge and not take a position of moral clarity and say, oh, we're against this altogether. Like, because their societies are watching it and they don't understand the context and they only get the most awful algorithm driven portions of this or who they're listening to as authorities, because we have this kind of anti-authority concept that the phone becomes the war, not actual the fighting.
But isn't it the problem that urban warfare by its very nature involves higher civilian casualties? And
Absolutely.
that's been a big problem in Gaza, hasn't it, for Israel?
Absolutely. I mean, this is why I have a lot of work to do, because in the urban areas, the civilian deaths, the what we call the laws of war are most contested in urban areas where you're a good military, like Israel, like the United States and Australia, want to protect populations and protect hospitals and protect, but the phone can make people misbelieve that they're actually not doing that. But in the urban area, this is why militaries don't want to fight in urban areas, because
Mm.
that awareness, it almost becomes, it becomes the fight of the narrative becomes the fight rather than destroying the enemy, because it's a contest of wills.
Interesting. Okay, two final questions because I think our time is coming to an end. You're in Australia. What are you doing there? What's your message? Who are you speaking to?
Sure, I was honored to have an invitation from a bunch of organizations, so I just kind of lumped them together, from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute to the Center of Independent Studies to the Zionist Federation of Australia, and even some federal government leaders, to share my on the ground research, but also my decade of urban warfare research, which has really been a problem for even Australian leaders to understand what is Israel doing, what was the realm of possible, what has ever come before, to include in Western militaries faced with anything similar. So I kind of lumped this trip together with a whole bunch of organizations and trying to share what my research has been and the analysis that I've done that seems to not be making it to the top of the talking points that people keep sharing.
Yeah, interesting. So I don't know if you know, there's this wonderful author in Australia, John Marston, who wrote Tomorrow When the War Began. And it's basically a teenage young adult book that we were all made to read when we we're at school. And it's a fictional what if Australia got invaded. And it goes to a lot of the things that you study about how a society might adapt and respond to an invasion, civilians, and in this case, teenage kids. Anyway, I loved this book, and it's probably one of the reasons I'm so interested in this topic to this day. But I'm blessed to live in two countries, island countries, that really we don't see the likelihood of an invasion at all. And in fact, if you suggest that, it's kind of stupid and you're laughed at. So I wonder how much you think what you're researching matters to countries like Australia, the UK, other Western countries that feel they'll never be invaded. Urban warfare strategies and that total defense idea that you talked about, is it something that we actually all should be integrating into our defense postures?
I believe so. I mean, some of this is people forget easily, right? So societies forget easily. They forget that Australia was attacked in World War II. It was at the door. And had things gone differently, they would have been fighting for their survival. And really, nations who forget that their national security can be threatened, and why these topics are really important, because it also creates a new global international norm of who we are, what we will say is acceptable in defending yourself. So Israel is just the small country surrounded by enemies, and many countries like Australia, United States, and others don't have that, but historically have had to face major wars for Western civilization, where if what you're saying about Israel, then you'll have to look at yourselves. But yes, even in defending the homeland and having that security, as the evolution of societies get complacent, they defund defense departments, they defund civil awareness of what their part will be if we all have to go to war in some way. Everybody wants peace. Peace through strength is a real concept that includes even home defense or total defense.
Okay, John Spencer, thank you so much for joining the podcast. You've been absolutely fascinating to talk to.
Thank you so much for having me.
And enjoy your time in Australia.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Latika Takes with me, Latika Burke. You can find my work at latikambirk.com and this podcast where you find all your podcasts. See you next time.